Richard Brown. I'm the director of the University of South Carolina Press. And I want to welcome everyone to this book launch with the author Claudia Smith Brinson, as well as Cecil Williams. We're delighted to have everyone here. The book is Stories of Struggle, and I simply want to welcome everyone here and thank Robin and her colleagues, Robin Waits and her colleagues at Historic Columbia, for facilitating this meeting, organizing this meeting, and hosting this meeting, and for all of the great work they do for our city and for our state. I also want to thank my colleague, Mackenzie Collier, our Publicity and Strategic Initiatives Director at the Press, for all her work on this book and many other books we publish. I just want to mention, Claudia, what a delight and an honor it's been to publish your book. It's beautifully written, it's compelling, it's interesting, it's fascinating, and perhaps more than anything, it's a call to action. And as you say at the end of the book, the struggle is not over, it continues. So in that spirit, then I will turn it over to Robin Waits. And Robin, I do want to announce, if you'll allow me, that Robin recently was awarded a Governor's Award by South Carolina Humanities, which is a very prestigious award given to people who really have had a huge impact on the humanities in this state as an advocate. And Robin, from all of us at the Press, thank you very much for the work you're doing at Historic Columbia. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Richard. It's great to be here tonight, and certainly appreciate all y'all for being with us, and we're delighted on behalf of Historic Columbia to host tonight's event, and just wanted to let y'all know how it's going to go over the next hour. I'm going to provide just a brief introduction and open the program with a question for Claudia. And as many of you may know, Stories of Struggle addresses civil rights activists and events across South Carolina, but because Historic Columbia is a co-host for this program, we've asked Claudia to really focus on the Midlands. She is more than willing to answer questions on topics that are broader than a Midlands focus, but that's what we've asked her to do just in terms of her presentation with us tonight. So wanted to also, following our conversation with Claudia, she is going to be joined by the very esteemed civil rights activist and photographer Cecil Williams, and they are going to talk about their partnership over the years and the role that relationship has played in this publication. So we'll have an opportunity for questions at the end of the program. Please feel free to add questions to the chat, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and those will go directly to me so that I can facilitate questions as time allows at the end of our program tonight. So I'm going to introduce Claudia Smith Brinson, who has worked as a journalist for more than 30 years in Florida, Greece, South Carolina. She was a national columnist and writing coach for Knight Ridder when the newspaper chain owned the state in Columbia. Her reporting there won more than 36 state and regional awards, and she was the first person to win Knight Ridder's Award of Excellence, not once, but twice. She was also the first person, or she was also a member of the newspaper team whose Hurricane Hugo coverage was a Pulitzer finalist, which is quite an accomplishment as well. Smith Brinson was named a South Carolina Woman of Achievement by the South Carolina Commission on Women, a South Carolina Journalist of the Year by the South Carolina Press Association, and held the Harriet Gray Blackwell Endowed Professorship at Columbia College. I have known Claudia for a long time, so this is both my personal and professional pleasure to participate in this book launch for Stories of Struggle. Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Richard. We're delighted to be a part of this this evening. So I'm going to just start out with a question for Claudia, and that will kick us off. And first, I want to offer congratulations again. This is a really exciting endeavor, and I know something that you have worked on for a long time. We're delighted to see it come to fruition. So it's been a long time in the works, and is certainly replete with stories of many unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. And wanted you to talk a little bit about your process for writing the book, and why you felt that these stories really needed to be told.
Well, thank you, Robin, and thank you, Richard, and thank you, Cecil, for being here, and all of you who are listening. This is so exciting to be here with you. It's hard to pinpoint when this book started. You could say it started when I entered the earth, and that I have from the start been someone who's interested in fairness and justice and in stories. And that was enhanced by my moving around as a military brat and living in a variety of different cultures. I'm constantly trying to figure out exactly how many, but I think about 16 in my first 23 years. And when I came to South Carolina, I have family connections with South Carolina, but had not lived here. I pretty quickly noticed, and maybe I should add that while I'm old enough to have lived in a segregated culture, because of the military desegregating, thanks to Harry Truman in 1949, I did not go to segregated schools. I went to military schools. And I came to South Carolina in the 70s and quickly decided as a young journalist, I sometimes say baby journalist, that I was going to focus on the stories that weren't told. And that was a big, wide range. Missing from newspapers at that point in time were women and children and the old and people of any color, all minorities, poor people. It gave me a wide portfolio, but it also gave me my own little struggle in terms of persuading the people above me that these were stories that were worthwhile to be in the newspaper. So along the way, I started meeting people and hearing their stories, and they stayed with me in a way that you might call haunted me. One of the early ones was Tom McCain, who was in Edgefield County and was interested in voting, and told the story of appearing at a precinct meeting with several other African Americans, and the white people in charge were so upset that they immediately sent everybody out to make phone calls and bring other white people in. And he described women literally coming out of the woods around the precinct meeting house in their slippers and their house robes and their hair curlers to stop African Americans from being part of the precinct meeting. That stayed with me. And if you skip years ahead, in 1994, I wanted to write about Briggs versus Elliott, and no one knew where the petitioners were. They, obviously, I started in Somerton, which was where Briggs versus Elliott, which was the first lawsuit in Brown versus the Board of Education, which most legal authorities agree was the most important legal decision by the Supreme Court in the history of the United States of America. And why hadn't people written about these petitioners? So I could go on and on. There were just so many times that I thought, this is a story that needs to be told. Why hasn't it been told? And then somewhere along the way, someone said, this is a book. And I said, yeah, this is a book. And so the book is shaped around the stories. It is not a traditional history book. I'm not a historian. It is a book that collects the stories of these people and collects them in a way that where they can function independently and intertwined, because it is about the civil rights movement. Begins with Reverend Hinton, the NAACP president from 41 to 58, who brought the national NAACP in and consequently fostered lawsuits that were some of the most important in the nation right here in South Carolina. Then moves to Briggs versus Elliott and the petitioners. The story's been told before, but not in terms of the petitioners, it's been told in terms of the great men, Earl Warren in the Supreme Court, the governors in South Carolina trying to maintain segregation, and of course, Thurgood Marshall, but not the petitioners who transformed their lives in very unpleasant ways because they were dedicated to having better lives for their children. And then Reverend Cecil Ivory, who fostered the sit-ins in Rock Hill, and from that, the sit-ins themselves. And then the very last section is on the hospital strike in 1969 in Charleston, which many believe was the last big event of the civil rights movement. So the people coalesced into discrete moments in time, and that became the story. I joke sometimes, and I'm always telling my students when I teach writing, the form follows function. The function was to tell the stories, and the form was going to have to collect the stories in a logical way. So that's how the book came about, and now it exists.
Thank you. We're really excited. I've had the opportunity, thanks to Mackenzie and Richard, to get a sneak peek, and it's been really a pleasure and an eye-opening experience to move through it with you. The numbers and the stories that just are not captured beyond, I think, the oral tradition or beyond members of the Black community is really astounding. And you know, we've talked, Claudia, for a long time about the Waverly neighborhood in particular in Columbia, and began, you know, we began working in that neighborhood about 17 years ago with residents, former residents, in an effort to document that historically Black community. And one of the names that came up over and over and over again was Reverend James Hinton. He really was a hero in that neighborhood, and certainly beyond. And I think you do a really extraordinary job of capturing the spirit and the action of Reverend Hinton as the subject of the first chapter of your book. And I think his story really sets the stage for all that follows. So I'm interested in why you find Hinton to be such a pivotal figure.
So Hinton became the president of the NAACP, the second president, in 1941. He was already an exceptional man. This is James Hinton. He had been orphaned as a toddler and brought up by an aunt in New York. He went to a Bible school and then was one of the few hundred Black officers during World War I. He was recruited in Augusta, which is where he mustered out, by Pilgrim Health and Life Insurance Company, which was unusual for its time, a Black life insurance company. He started opening territory and came to Columbia and became the president immediately in 1939 of the Columbia NAACP. As you can see, when you look at his face, that he's got those strong, direct eyes. The word strong just belongs with him. And that's how he was. He had feet planted firmly on the ground. He was never afraid. At times when maybe it might have been wise to, he was daring and bold, and he said what needed to be said, even though there were consequences for that in the time that he lived in, terrible consequences. And I thought what I would do is, because one of the things you need to understand about Reverend Hinton is how indefatigable he was. I have selected a few minutes here of a piece that's about getting the vote. I thought people might have the vote on their mind right now. So I'm going to read a little about his effort with people in Columbia to get the vote for African Americans. At this point in time, barely 10,000 African Americans were registered in the entire state because of all the efforts South Carolina made to make sure Black people didn't vote. Since 1942, Reverend E.A. Adams, Columbia NAACP president, and Reverend James Miles Hinton, then the NAACP state conference president, have been raising money, $6,000. That would be about $64,000 today. And that money had been raised by nickels and dimes and donations, by the $1 a month dues that were paid the NAACP. And they raised it under the name of the Negro Citizens Committee. Oftentimes, citizens committees were sort of in front of the NAACP because it was so dangerous to join the NAACP. Hinton by now had gotten the attention of NAACP national leaders because of his ability to grow the NAACP in South Carolina. And Thurgood Marshall, the legal counsel, supported him in wanting to, quote, knock down the white primary in South Carolina. So South Carolina only allowed white people to vote in the primary. Well, you know, if you could only vote in the primary and the primary determined who was going to win, then you weren't a voter, were you? Hinton, who went to the top regularly, called white legislators and their means of oppressing people subterfuge, chicanery, and thievery. And he religiously documented their obstruction. He sent affidavits to the US Justice Department, sought federal intervention, and announced his actions in press releases. In July, Hinton and 5 other Black Colombians appeared before the state Democratic Party's purging committee to protest the removal of all Black voters' names from the rolls. Committee members informed them the political party was exclusively white. They were barred from voting solely because of race and color. In December 1945, Hinton wrote the US Attorney General to demand investigations into voter registration. He wrote, "Negroes are denied the right to vote in the Democratic primary of South Carolina, and to deny them the right to register even for the general election makes null and void all of their rights as citizens of the United States, for which they have fought and died like all other persons." By now we have World War II, and more than 1 million Black Americans had fought in the war and yet still couldn't vote. A year later, when a US Department of Justice spokesman denied awareness, Hinton replied he had sent 25 affidavits. So in 1944, he had handpicked potential registrants. None has succeeded. So now we're in 1946. They're again failing until George Elmore tried. One afternoon, Hinton, John McCrae, who was a Black journalist, and others were waiting on Columbia's Millwood Avenue. 4 of the 5 men had crossed the street to a two-room store, only to be told the registration books weren't there. Enrollment clerks hid the books the second a Black person appeared. The men could see into the store through its plate glass windows and waited for the store clerk to register a white customer. At the moment that they planned to rush over, there was no way to get in. So they went back, but now it was clear that they were trying to get in. Then George Elmore arrived, and this is George Elmore. He was portly, chatty, light-skinned. He served as secretary of the Richland County's Progressive Democratic Party, which was a biracial organization. He owned a Gervais Street 5 and Dime and 2 liquor stores, drove for Blue Ribbon Taxi Cab Company, and hired out as a photographer. He volunteered, crossed the street, walked in, bought a Coca-Cola, and listened as the white woman complained about them damn Negroes across the street. Now, that's not the word she said, but it's the one I'll use. She got the book and she instructed Will Elmore in writing his name in the E section. When Elmore completed his address, a location recognizably in a Black neighborhood, she yelled, "Then you're a damn Negro too." Elmore stepped out of the store a second or two later and shouted, "Hey, she says you other Negroes might as well come on in and enroll too." McCrae lived in a different ward. That's how Elmore, Hinton, Dr. R.W. Nance, Reverend E.A. Davis, and Reverend F.M. Young registered. On August 13th, 1946, Elmore showed his poll tax receipt and was denied a vote in Richland County's Democratic Party because he was not white. The NAACP filed an injunction on behalf of Elmore and 60 others. In District State Court, attorneys argued that the Democratic Party was a private voluntary association of individuals mutually acceptable to each other. So Elmore had lost no constitutional rights or privileges. "There is no right so basic as the right to vote," argued Marshall. South Carolina ran the nation's last all-white primary. Hinton had challenged the General Assembly for conspiring to steal the ballot from 43% of its electorate. He said it was time for the state to redeem itself by, quote, "producing some statesmen." On July 12, 1947, District Judge J. Wades Waring agreed. He opened the primary in Elmore v. Rice with the observation, "It is time for South Carolina to rejoin the Union." Elmore announced, "In the words of our other champion, Joe Louis, all I can say is, I glad I win." He referred to the Brown Bomber, who was boxing's world heavyweight champion from 1937 to 1949. South Carolina appealed. This is what South Carolina had always done. I experienced it myself, watching lawsuits go through South Carolina all the way up to the Supreme Court before it would win. South Carolina appealed. Hinton warned, "The Negroes who are determined to vote are not going to give an inch." The Fourth Circuit rejected the argument by the state's attorneys that Black citizens had no more right to vote in the Democratic primary, quote, "than to vote in the election of officers of the Forest Lake Country Club, an exclusive whites-only club that's still here in Columbia." The December 30th, 1947 decision written by Judge John J. Parker called the country club comparison a fundamental error. Quote, "An essential feature of our form of government is the right of the citizen to participate in the governmental process." On April 21st, 1948, Hinton, McCrae, and Elmore and wife Laura Delaney Elmore voted in a city primary. And here, if you count in 1, 2, 3, 4, the man with the open collar and the white shirt, that's Hinton getting ready to vote. I'm happy as a lark, Hinton told the state, the Columbia morning paper. It might seem a man so focused on repetitively addressing infinite obstructions might be grim, but Hinton possessed an understated wry humor. The Charleston mayor had declared, I'd rather die and go to hell before seeing Negroes vote in our primary. And Hinton observed, when the man died, a white man always keeps his word. In May, sure that Jim Crow still held sway, the state Democratic Party required that an aspiring voter had to swear belief in the social, religious, and educational separation of the races in order to qualify to vote. The NAACP sued again. It won again. Waring ruled the court would not excuse further subterfuge, struck down the oath, ordered enrollment books open until July 31st, and promised to jail anyone in contempt of his orders. Afterward, 35,000 Black citizens registered. And this is the picture of some of those Columbia voters going out to vote after they had won the second lawsuit. Segregationists burned crosses at Elmore's home. They refused to supply his stores. They inundated his work and home life with death threats. And others were suffering when they tried to vote too. In Calhoun Falls on August 10th, Reverend Archie Ware cast his primary ballot and almost died for it. White men surrounded him, beat him with clubs, cut him with hawk-bill knives, and left him for dead while 2 police officers watched. Hinton filed an affidavit for Ware, asked Thurman to investigate. This is Governor J. Strom Thurman, and asked the U.S. Justice Department to bring criminal prosecution. Ware identified the attackers and left for Illinois in safety. 7 weeks later, the state constable only commented that investigations could take 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months. I guess he could have said 3 years, 30 years, because nothing ever happened to the attackers. So, do you appreciate your vote a little more now? In the midst of all this, of course, was the Ku Klux Klan. And so Hinton was pursued by them regularly. They surrounded his Waverly home in 1941. His neighbors got up on the roofs with guns to protect him. They abducted him in 1949. They shot shotgun blasts into his home in 1956. This is members of the KKK in South Carolina on the State House steps on December 7th, 1957. They marched up and down Main Street, and then they formed a human cross on the State House grounds. And this was a few weeks after they had admittedly bombed Claudia Sanders' home. She was a Gaffney Cherokee teacher who dared to write an essay proposing that desegregation in a slow manner in public schools was appropriate. Unusual for South Carolina, 5 of the KK members involved in this were arrested, but charges against 2 were dropped. 1 mysteriously died at home when a car crushed him, and the other 2 were acquitted. And I would like to point out, when you see the next picture, and you might not have been able to see it in the previous picture, people aren't wearing hoods. They're wearing, I guess I would call it hats, but they aren't hiding their faces because there was no shame in being a part of this group if you were white. And so there also was such an acceptance that you could gather on the State House grounds. You could be permitted to, when Black people were not. Black people were arrested if they walked across the State House grounds at that point in time. So that's a little look at the 40s and the 50s in South Carolina.
Thanks, Claudia. I think reading the stories of Hinton that you have outlined really underscore the commitment and the resilience and he was just an unflappable fighter in this story, and it's really great to see his story pulled together in a way that celebrates his efforts. I wanted to kind of shift to the 4th chapter of the book, which is entitled "Whatever They Call You, That's Not Your Name." And you do a really extraordinary job with that chapter, developing a comprehensive exploration of sit-ins in South Carolina. And one of the interesting revelations for me was really the leadership by college and high school students. And was wondering if you could just address when and why Columbia students first staged sit-ins and talk a little bit about the impact of those sit-ins.
Okay, so there had been sit-ins since the 40s, organized sit-ins by the Congress of Racial Equality, which was a biracial group that had started in Chicago and it emanated from the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was a group of conscientious objectors, and that group had existed during World War I and World War II. Many of the core founders went to prison as conscientious objectors and served years. And then there was the NAACP, which, as I've pointed out, was very strong in South Carolina, thanks to Reverend Hinton and his dedication. So those two groups were key to the sit-ins, and sit-ins were happening with the NAACP in Oklahoma successfully, and in Chicago with CORE successfully. Mary Church Terrell, whose name you may recognize, was an important African-American activist in Washington, D.C., managed to challenge through the sit-in segregation so successfully that service to Black people in Washington, D.C. was ruled to be required by the Supreme Court. So in February 1st, 1960, as many of you probably know, students in Greensboro decided to sit in, and this was after one of them had been denied service at a bus depot. And this time they spread. And so they flew through North Carolina day after day, Raleigh, Durham, and toward the end of the second week, Charlotte. And then on February 12th, first organized sit-in was held in South Carolina at Rock Hill. And this was a big deal. The Associated Press was writing, "Into the bastion of segregation and cross the border into the deep South." People were evidently somewhat unnerved that now the sit-ins were in South Carolina. So Columbia was a little late to the game. It was March when Columbia had its first sit-ins. I'm going to read you just a couple of paragraphs about the first 2 days and then tell you a little more about that. So we're going to start on March 2nd, in the morning, which is when the first sit-in began. About 500 students gathered on the eastern side of Columbia's downtown on a dreary Wednesday morning, March 2nd. They were from Allen University and Benedict College, side by side, historically Black colleges, just a mile from Main Street, their compact campuses bounded by city blocks. In the morning sleet and rain, about 200 students marched 2 by 2 to the core of the white shopping area. They walked in and out of stores, and at noon, small groups converged on lunch counters at Cress and Woolworth. In the weeks before, a carload of Columbia students, including Benedict's Talmadge Neal and Allen's Simon P. Bowie and his twin Samuel Preston Bowie, had visited the Greensboro protesters to discuss what the Allen and Benedict students quickly understood was a movement. When 40 to 50 Black students entered Woolworth, the manager had already closed all but 2 of the seating sections of the lunch counter. As soon as the Columbia students sat, he closed the open sections too. The men and women read textbooks or Bibles for about 10 minutes before departing. Protester Jack Simmons told a reporter, "If we can spend our money at the counters, we should be able to eat there too." The Columbia Record reported their stay at the white counter didn't even interrupt a half dozen white patrons who kept on drinking their coffee or eating their pie. At Crest, white patrons already occupied most of the seats. Employees roped off a dozen or so open seats and put up a sign saying "closed in interest of public safety." And the students there decided to return to campus. They were heckled, but they were not attacked. On Thursday, March 3rd, about 300 students gathered, leaving the campus around 11 a.m. They marched in pairs, wearing hats and their long all-weather coats against the cold. They sang "We Shall Overcome" and "Oh, Freedom," passing occasionally between gauntlets of white observers lining Taylor Street and intent on intimidating them. City, county, and state law enforcement officers awaited them, as did an aide to the governor. The students had selected 10 locations. They stayed on Main Street for about 2 hours, visiting Woolworth, Crest, McCrory's, H.L. Green, Walgreen, Eckerd, and Silver's, as well as Taps and Belk department stores and the Greyhound bus depot, where they sat quietly in their overcoats on the wooden pews of the whites-only waiting room. Downtown businesses posted signs that said "carry-out service only" and "no trespassing." On the street, a group of white men formed a line of their own and marched toward the demonstrators, laughing and yelling, but didn't attack. This time, 2 students managed to obtain service at McCrory's. A young man described in news reports afterward as, quote, a light-skinned Negro, entered ahead of the students, sat at the counter, told the waitress he was in a hurry, and ordered tea and a hamburger. When served, he passed the food along to what the newspaper called a darker companion. The manager closed the counter, turned off the lights, and closed the store for an hour. So this is the way that many of the first sit-ins were held. The students were making a point. They were making a point about the fact that they were human, they had dignity, they could comport themselves with dignity, they could look, as you can see, beautiful and appropriate in their church clothes, if you want to use that word, and they could be peaceful in their demand for human rights. And so they didn't stay very long if they weren't welcome, or if they did stay, and of course they weren't going to be welcome. If they did stay, they read their textbooks, they perused their Bibles, and if things got a little too risky, then they quietly left. Now, 2 of the leaders were David Carter and Robert DeVoe, and they were cousins. They had grown up together, and they had both served in the military. David Carter was a Korean War veteran. He's the one on, let's see, my left. He's the one with the sunglasses. And that's Robert DeVoe next to him. He had served in the European theater. And they were back going to school. And David Carter was a Baptist preacher who was studying theology. And Robert DeVoe, I interviewed Carter's family. He had passed on by this time. And he, by the way, had worked as the number 2 and 3 man with the SCLC and Martin Luther King after this. Robert DeVoe said that their time in the military, and this is interesting, had given them the self-discipline to be peaceful under great stress, and that they knew how to behave in these situations, and that made them useful and natural leaders. So typically the college presidents, when attacked about their Black students doing this, would be mum. They would try to avoid saying anything. But Baycoats, the president at Allen, he stuck up for the students, and he said that this was part of democracy, and a learning institution would suppress students from trying to learn and express their beliefs in democracy. The day after that the students walked, they gave a statement to the mayor, to the police chief, and to the state, the Columbia's morning paper. And they said that they intended to protest unfair, inequitable, discriminatory treatment at public and transportation services patronized by Negroes. And then they got to the real point in their third point. It is often said by certain political leaders that the Negro in the South graciously accepts segregation and in some instances desires it, that whatever agitation is made against segregation is by outsiders. This demonstration was to indicate that segregation may be here for a long time and the Negro may have to endure and tolerate it, but he does not willingly and voluntarily accept it. Now, in Columbia, the NAACP was very much in charge. And the elders were not entirely comfortable with what the students were doing. The students were doing this because they weren't happy with the success of the elders. So in many of the towns, I mentioned that Columbia was a little late to the game. The students didn't consult with the elders at all. They hoped they would show up to bail them out, but they were completely independent. CORE was involved in almost all of South Carolina's protesting towns, training students in nonviolent direct action. And the students were studying not Martin Luther King, but Gandhi. And they were marvelously consistent in understanding the points that Gandhi had made when he overthrew the British Empire in India, which is that Satyagraha, which later became translated as soul power, required that you not respond in kind to an assault, but you looked at your assailant with love and in their eyes to hope that they would see your humanity too. And you accepted their punishment and tried to persist in your nobility, which is an amazing concept. And you think about this, these are 18 to 20-year-olds, in some cases high school students who practice this on their campuses, and then they go out and they live it. And I want to say that in South Carolina, there's this idea that South Carolina was benevolent and moderate. That's not true. It was last in almost every sort of acceptance of desegregation. And people attacked these students all the time. Cigarettes were burned in their backs. They were thrown off stools, males and females. They were had ammonia thrown in their eyes, which is an intent to blind somebody. There were baseball bats involved. In one city, a woman walked up and down behind the protesters, banging her baseball bat, trying to scare them. Knives were used in attacks. It was a very, very dangerous experience to have. So, Robin, should I go on with that?
So why don't we, we've talked about the youth involved in this movement, and I think we have an opportunity to bring in our esteemed partner here, Cecil Williams, who certainly joined this fight as a very young person.
So Cecil, I am so happy that Cecil's here with me. Cecil is my mentor and my friend, and I met Cecil decades ago, and I would consult with him all the time to make sure I was understanding things correctly, and I would look at his photographs, and we're going to see some in a few seconds. I should mention that the earlier photographs you've seen are things that I collected in my research from Richland Library, which has the state newspapers archives, and from South Carolina Library at USC. But my first reference point was always Cecil, because he was there and he understood what was going on because he was there, even as a very 9 years old, Cecil. And it helped me so much as a writer. Cecil and I are going to talk about this, to be able to look at people's faces and look at the circumstances they were in, and build a better understanding of the people that I was writing about. So all hail Cecil.
So I'm going to just do a brief introduction of Cecil, because if anyone deserves an introduction, it certainly would be a long one, Cecil, but we're going to. So Cecil is an American photographer. He's a publisher. He's an author, an inventor, really best known for his photography documenting the civil rights movement here in South Carolina, beginning in the 1950s. And he began his documentation at the tender age of 11 years old. He was photographing weddings and family parties. He studied art at Claflin, while also being a photographer for the university. His work has been published in hundreds of books, newspapers, and television documentaries. His photography and art has been exhibited in galleries across the country. And he recently opened a history museum. It's named the Cecil Williams South Carolina Civil Rights Museum in his hometown of Orangeburg, South Carolina. And it features hundreds of his civil rights photography for national publications. Mr. Williams is no doubt an icon in our state and country, and it really is an honor to have him with us tonight. I'm going to.
Good evening, everyone. I'm coming to you from Orangeburg and inside the museum I've created. And I would be remiss if I did not ask everyone, when we come out of this crisis with this microscopic enemy that we are facing, that I'd like to invite you to come to my museum. Claudia, I could not put down your book, Stories of Struggle, when I first received copies of it, because it's amazing that even though I marched and I demonstrated and participated and knew almost everyone in your book had a first-hand experience, you actually in your book, Stories of Struggle, really know and reveal more about them than I did even knowing them in person. So that I could not put your book down. And I want to congratulate you for really bringing to the forefront some of South Carolina's hidden history, some of our hijacked history, and to put more in perspective that here in South Carolina, although historians don't readily admit it or point to it, and we have not really published enough books to document it. But here in South Carolina, we are really in the epicenter of the creation of the origin of the American Civil Rights Movement. And I'm referring, of course, to Briggs versus Elliott in Clarendon County. But I want to really congratulate you, and everyone should read this book. This is a book really about people who many of them you've never heard of. Many people that you talk about in your book, they deserve to be just as well known and talked about and given credit for it as the Reverend Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. But unfortunately, this is a picture of the Briggs petitioners. You and I discussed earlier about the time that this was taken, but certainly from about the mid 1950s to about the late, maybe almost 1960. But here you see most of the petitioners and people participating in a Sunday afternoon church recognition program. And almost everyone on here who really signed the Briggs petitioners, you can better believe that if they signed that name during those days on that petition, they had to leave town to gain employment. Even if you were related to them, a brother, a sister, cousin, any way connected with them, you were also, again, attacked by the South Carolina people that really felt that you were destroying their way of life. The importance about the Briggs versus Elliott case is the first case in history to attack segregation in public education. That's one fact about it. The other amazing thing about it is this was the first of the 5 cases. This was the catalyst case that led to, again, Brown versus Board of Education. Governor Jimmy Burns asked his friends on the Supreme Court that if this case, again, was going to be one of the 5 cases, that it not be named after the South Carolina, Clarendon County, Somerton, South Carolina case called Briggs versus Elliott. But he preferred that it be named after the Topeka, Kansas Brown case. So that's how that took the limelight off of, again, this South Carolina case. I grew up with these people as a young photographer, starting around 12 and 13 years old when I photographed Thurgood Marshall coming to Charleston, South Carolina to begin arguing that case in Charleston. And my other connection is that my mother was a teacher and actually taught with the Reverend J.A. Delany, who is seen right at the middle of this photograph. And I happen to, again, know about these people at such an early age that, again, when I read in the papers and the newspapers and the magazines and other publications about other movements throughout the country, I could not believe that they were getting more publicity and there was more attention to them, wherein here is a contemporary early 20th century movement that we really started. In fact, we started it such a long time ago. In its infancy, it was not even called the civil rights movement, but really the human rights, because again, here were a group of people in Clarendon County, South Carolina, an agricultural community with just ordinary people signing names on a petition that went all the way from Clarendon County to the United States Supreme Court. I think that this is a book that everyone should read. This is, I am so happy to have been associated with you in this project. And you have really, again, told some of that hidden history and brought these people to life and really helped to really pay tribute to them for the sacrifices they made in the pursuit of freedom, justice, and equality.
So you can see what a kind and generous person Cecil is and what he says. Chandler, could we go back to that picture so we could talk about the picture, the first one you showed? So Cecil was going with E.C. Jones, right, to take some of these pictures. He's the youthful apprentice, but sometimes he's photographing these very important people. If you look in the very center of the photograph, the woman with the light colored dress is Eliza Briggs. Above her, slightly to the side, in the what looks like a plaid suit with a big smile, that's Harry Briggs. And the plaid shirt above him is Harry Briggs Jr. If you go back down to Eliza, to the right of her is Annie Gibson, and two more down is Maisie Solomon. And the three of them were working as housekeepers at motels. They were fired from their jobs. Harry Briggs was fired from his job because their names were on the petition. And we could do hours on all the consequences that they suffered. If you go up to the very top, Reverend Delane was run out of the state. He dared not come back. And this was after his house had been burned down, his church had been burned down, he'd been shot at. To the side of him, the shorter man in the darker suit is James Seals. His house was burned down. To the right is Reverend Richburg. He was threatened with whippings. And he was the one that stayed to hold the fort after Reverend Delane in 1955 was chased out of town. So another Cecil picture. I'm not sure whether you can see it, but right under this man's legs is the box that Cecil had to lug. And what did it carry inside it, Cecil?
Inside that box was extra film for the 4x5 camera that E.C. Jones owned. I have it on exhibit today at my museum in Orangeburg. But this was a time when we used film to photograph events, and a large format, 4x5-inch film. And we used what was called the Speed and Crown graphic cameras. E.C. Jones befriended me at a very early age to help him supplement his photography for the yearbook at South Carolina State University. So I was kind of drawn into the Briggs versus Elliott dilemma at a very early age before I really began to understand their important role that they were playing in Clarendon County. This is on a Sunday afternoon when the people have gathered together again for paying tribute to some of the people who have signed their names. You see Harry Briggs about in the middle top left, and then you see the father of E.C. Jones, my photographer mentor, on the far right on the second row. But again, these are genuine American heroes. And again, so unfortunate that our history that people know about, the mainstream histories of America, have not recorded their really their great deeds and the sacrifices they made in pursuit of really making America a place for all people and all colors.
Can we see another photograph, Chandler?
This is Crest in downtown Orangeburg, where the management has removed the stools from the backs from the stools to prevent people of color from sitting down. I myself was attempted to sit in this particular place. It was difficult to really be separated as from being a journalist, a eyewitness, or a participant, because police authorities, law enforcement, only saw me as really one of the marchers who had a camera. They were not welcome to see this. Often, at least in 2 instances, when I was arrested in Orangeburg, they took my camera away from me before beginning to proceed in arresting other demonstrators. I'd like to bring out here one important fact. You see today people marching and demonstrating and carrying on protests. What is the reason behind this? The reason behind this was to really have a way and a say in really bringing attention to a problem, because the problem in South Carolina and the Deep South was that people of color were not treated as first-class citizens, unable to vote, unable to go into a store and buy a hamburger, unable to try clothes on in a store, unable to sit where other people sat on public transportation, unable to participate in all the things that all other citizens were able to do. We were treated as second-class citizens during this period. And we, again, fought against, the segregated laws of the state of South Carolina, and also the laws that govern, again, segregation throughout the United States, because it was not just in South Carolina that these laws prevailed.
So in the two Briggs pictures in this picture, you can see how for a writer, photographs of the past can be really important. Eliza Briggs, Maisie Solomon, and Gibson I met. They were still alive. Most of the other people were gone. And so those women with their smiles, the children standing there proud, that tells me something about the petitioners and their ability to last. Schools were not desegregated in South Carolina to 71. And some of those people's children, or youngest children, were the people who desegregated the schools because they were still signing petitions. And the other thing is, when you look at that picture with the stools gone, when the White Citizens Council pretty much shut down stores because they didn't want Black people coming in, these were in counties where Black people were the majority. And so they were eliminating the majority of their customers, and in their punitive mode, they also were hampering their white customers from sampling their wares. So they, you know, the cliche, cut off your nose to spite your face. So Cecil's photographs were so instructive to me, because I'm talking to people and then the pictures affirm them, or I'm reading something and the pictures make me ask other questions. It becomes a wonderful conversation. And before we take your questions, I want to tell a little story about Cecil that he told me. So he was saying his camera was taken away at one of the Orangeburg marches. He's down trying to on his knees, trying to document the fire hoses that they're using. South Carolina was not moderate. There were fire hoses, there was tear gas, there were police dogs attacking the students. Cecil's down on his knees trying to document this. Two policemen come along, lift him up by his arms, drag him off to the police car, grab his camera. It was a Rolleiflex, right, Cecil?
Yes.
Rip the film out of his Rolleiflex, toss them into the trunk of the car so he can't have his film or his camera, leave Cecil in the car, and Cecil unwires their radio, right?
They sat me in the front seat of their patrol car, and I wasn't quite altogether 100% nonviolent or active. I reached under and I pulled all the wires out and disabled it. But my mother told me that I should not have done that, that I should have, you know, just sat in the car and not, you know, taken any action.
Well, it was only violence toward a radio, right?
Yes.
Not a person. So Cecil is so special, and he has some wonderful books. So you can see more of these pictures in his books, like Freedom and Justice. And I would recommend you do that.
See, this is just like Claudia, to promote others' books while we are here talking about her publication. But I echo that. Cecil Williams is certainly a treasure for us in South Carolina. I wanted to, first of all, thank y'all for your comments and for being with us today to share your stories and talk about your work, Claudia. We have a couple of questions that I'm gonna share. We'll just take these two that I've got because we're a little short on time. But the first question, Claudia, was the news media complicit in fostering the myth that South Carolina was benevolent and moderate in its reaction to civil rights? Or was it more a matter of seeming moderate in contrast to what was happening in Mississippi and Alabama?
It's a complicated answer. And part of it is that, yes, the white media were censoring. In Columbia, my understanding is that after the first sit-ins, there was a deliberate effort to just not cover them. They covered the arrests, they covered the sentencings, but not the protests themselves. But when you say Mississippi and Alabama, I think the difference there is not that we were more moderate, but that the TV cameras weren't there. If you think about Edmund Pettus Bridge, which you may be familiar with because of John Lewis's participation in his recent death, It was on live TV, and that stunned people. But people using truncheons to beat people to the ground, that happened in South Carolina. Police officers were doing that, not just to young men, but to women too. And I talked to activists who had been injured. In the Orangeburg March, people had to go to the hospital. Someone was blinded. Someone had a leg broken. I could go on. So how do we end up with this idea that South Carolina is moderate? Is propaganda. It's propaganda from the newspapers. It's propaganda from people like Hollings, Governor Hollings, Governor McNair, Governor Thurmond. It's white people being complicit in that, or having white privilege where they can be ignorant of it and choose to be ignorant. There are a lot of forces coming to bear on silencing people. And I should also add here that some of these experiences were obviously really difficult and very traumatic. And so I talked to people who hadn't told their stories before. They were kind enough to talk to me about them when I asked them, but they might not have told their children or their grandchildren because they were too upsetting. So sometimes the people whose stories I'm collecting are people who have not told their stories because of the difficulty of telling them.
The last question that we'll take tonight is, so many Americans assume that people of color have no basis to complain because they, quote, won the civil rights legislation that Congress passed in the 1960s. So looking at such things as racial gerrymandering, obstacles placed to voting, and even challenges raised to the outcome of the recent presidential election. How much has American attitudes towards racial justice and social equity changed in the last 60 years?
Valinda Littlefield, who was on Walter Edgar with me, has read the book, and she said she kept writing in the margins, obstruction, obstruction, obstruction. The rights of full citizenship are still obstructed. That would be the simple way of answering that, is for some reason, many of the people in power do not really want a democracy. They do not want full participation that's guaranteed by the Constitution. And many of the civil rights lawsuits were succeeded because of the 14th Amendment that says the states cannot abridge the rights of citizens. And so Cecil used the phrase first-class citizenship. This is what Reverend Hinton talked about all the time. He said, if you don't have the vote, you're not a first-class citizen. And let me remind you again, Reverend Hinton he was in World War I, his son was in World War II. So some of these people have gone off and fought for democracy in Europe, and they come back and they're still not first-class citizens. And you know, we could get into a debate about human rights and being deserving of human rights, but I don't think deserve is a word that belongs there. And it's distressing to see the problems that there are now and to see that they continue. And I would say, read my book and you will find out about the many manifold ways, and this is the dark side of the book, that white supremacists kept this state from growing, particularly with education. If you look at the problems that South Carolina has in terms of income or health, they're because we have never, as South Carolinians, wanted to educate everybody. And we pay, all of us pay for consequences of that. So enough preaching, read the book, because the bright side is that you're gonna meet people who are gonna inspire you. You're gonna meet people like I did that you will love. And it will give you hope, because you'll understand, I need someone to help me with this word. I'm going to say ordinary, but I don't really mean ordinary. You're going to meet people who were ordinary and became extraordinary, but they're people like you and me, and they made the world a better place, and so can you.
Thank you, Claudia. And thanks for uncovering these stories, taking the opportunity to really listen to people and document these stories, and be willing to do this over such a long period of time and share this with us. So I know we can't clap on here but I would clap. Thank you again for everything that y'all have done. I also want to thank Richard for giving us an opportunity to co-host this event, and Mackenzie as well. It's been a wonderful partnership, and we look forward to more. If any of you who are still with us, participants, if you purchased a book from the Historic Columbia online website, you can pick it up from the Robert Mills House this Saturday between 10 and 12 or Tuesday between 10 and 12. And we can email you that information again as well. If you haven't purchased the book, there's a URL down on that title slide that you can get to get it. And Claudia, if you leave a note, she will inscribe the book or sign it in any way that you like. We just need a couple of days for her to do that in order to get it back to you. I hope you enjoyed the program. And if you're interested in local history, visit us at historiccolumbia.org. You can become a member. You can sign up for more fabulous programs like this. You can get engaged in the community in a lot of really wonderful and dynamic ways. And I hope that you will check us out for more, and please go and buy Claudia's book, because it really is it's a life changer. Thank you all again for being with us, and have a good evening. Happy Thanksgiving.